Okay, reminding you of the change in the agenda this evening. It gives me great pleasure to welcome, and thank you very much, Trevor, for coming this evening, Trevor Phillips.
You had to explain who I am.
No.
I was waiting for the biography.
Well, I was going to do the Howard.
Okay, don't do that one. Have I got the microphone? Can you all hear me? Has everybody got somewhere to sit down? Because I'm going to talk for 4 or 5 hours now. First of all, let me apologise. I'd hoped to be with you longer, but we had basically a diary situation, so I had to move something earlier and something a little later. But I can't keep the people later waiting too long. So what I want to do, Thea's asked me to take some questions. So what I want to do is to speak for about 10-15 minutes, and then I'll take about 10-15 minutes of questions, because I know there are issues that people want to raise. Can I start in a way where Theo left off, and also say something about Rosa? I think we've got to be... You're right to say 10 years. It's a long time, and we were talking about some of the same things 10 years ago. We were talking about some of the same things, forgive me, I've been there a long time, 30 years ago, actually. But the fact that that's true doesn't necessarily mean that nothing has happened. Actually, as I'll go on to say, I think quite a lot of change has happened, and quite a great deal of that change has happened because of the efforts of people in this room, and people like you, us. So the fact that we are dealing with some of the same issues doesn't mean that the effort and the actions and the campaigning has been pointless. And I think it's really important for us to make sure we start from that premise, because I've been, over the 30 years, in many situations where we can talk ourselves into a frame of mind that sort of suggests that actually it's all a bit pointless, and the things that we ask people to do, and the effort that people put in doesn't make that much difference. I think it does, and there is actually no better example, I think, than the 10 years since the report of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, what I want to say a few words about. I think that we've moved on a long way from the conditions that there were 10 years ago, perhaps, but not far enough, and certainly not fast enough. We now face a whole new challenge. After a period of sustained economic growth, we're now entering recession. And what we know is going to happen from our history, is that the people who got the smallest rewards in the good times are going to bear the biggest burden in the difficult times. We know that those who are stuck at the bottom of the social and economic pile are going to get it in the neck. So let me start by saying I'm not complacent about the state of equality in Britain today, but I think we need to respond to the problems of today in a way that relates to and reflects how Britain's changed over this period. But let me, in a way, mark the start from Stephen Lawrence's murder, the campaign that followed. Those of you who have seen the report that we did will see that we're pretty clear about our view about this. That was a moment when this country changed. Now, it changed for some objective reasons, but I'd like to also say that that change was driven by people. Theo's already mentioned Doreen, but I think there's no question that the steadfastness, I've said this before in Doreen's presence, and I don't want to overdo it and so on, but actually, how can you overdo it? Doreen and Neville's absolute persistence, the dignity with which they pursued the campaign, the certainty, the honesty with which they pursued it, I think, in itself, nothing else had happened, in itself changed the way we thought about many of these issues. And suffice it to say, without Doreen, we wouldn't have had an inquiry, Relations Amendment Act, we wouldn't have had any serious change in the behaviour of many of our public institutions. But I think all of those things have happened. But there have been some background changes as well. People have changed. 15 years on, I think that we are, and I know that the way I've been reported makes me sound like some kind of Pollyanna who thinks that we're living in a wonderful, marvellous, nothing more to be done society. I don't believe that. And I don't believe anybody in this room who knows me thinks for a minute that I believe that. But I think it's important to recognise that people have changed. One reason it's important to recognise that is that we need to understand why they've changed and do a bit more to make them change more. We know that there's just some objective changes. Almost 20% of children under 16 in this country are from an ethnic minority now. Nearly 10% of children live in a family that has black, white, multiple, or Asian, multiple heritages. The existence of children in that situation doesn't in itself prove anything that everything has changed. But what it is an indicator that we are in a different place than we were 30 years ago. But we know in spite of that inequalities remain. I don't need to talk in detail here about the disproportionate number of ethnic minority people living in poverty, or about the disproportionate in stop and search, or the fact that an African Caribbean young man is at least as likely to go to jail as he is to university. So what I would say is that the first thing we need to do, recognising there's been change, is to make sure that we're completing yesterday's tasks. I want to say a few words about tomorrow's tasks, but we first got to deal with yesterday's tasks. There's still a mountain of work to do to tackle racial prejudice. Stephen's murder didn't mark the end of racist violence, but let's be clear, community organisations were there and have been there and are still there at the front line to help society turn a corner on racist violence. And I think the work by the TJP, the Transformative Justice Project, as it's being projected, will do more to create a new environment for survivors and families of hate crime, something that we really need today. Of course, the heart searching and all the rest of it didn't banish stereotyping and prejudice in the police. We can go back to the secret policeman, we can look at the Commission for Racial Equality's 18-month inquiry, which I initiated as chairman, the biggest, most expensive and actually most far-reaching formal investigation the Commission ever had, which led, amongst other things, to a ban on BNP membership or National Front membership amongst police officers, which I think was a pretty remarkable achievement by the Commission. Not mine, but by the Commission as a whole. Police have made, I think, some solid progress on recruitment, training, and so on. But there's a lot of work to do on tackling the problems with stop and search, on dealing with the issues of information held on DNA databases, which we know is in itself disproportionate. They need to deal with the poor retention of new ethnic minority officers. Almost twice as many ethnic minority officers quit or are sacked in their first 6 months of service compared with their white colleagues, figures from 2007. And of course they need to address the canteen culture. And we know the canteen culture exists because when we look at the numbers in specialist forces, we see that some, particularly the elite ones, robbery and so on, are closed shops to ethnic minority recruits. The question is, what does that tell us about prescription? Well, we can, I've got a long section here, which I'm going to miss out, but those of you who will have looked at the speech that I made about the question of institutional racism will know that what I think about it is this. The facts do not let the police off the hook on what Macpherson meant by institutional racism. That's just a fact. We know we still have a systemic issue, and we've got systemic problems to deal with. But the question is, how do we best get a purchase on those problems? How do we get change? And my view is very simple. A wrangle over words where we are constantly being sucked into an argument about what it means, what it doesn't mean, does it apply to this person or that police station or not isn't helping us. What I really would like us to do is to focus more on the evidence, because what seems to me happens is that we get into arguments about, do you agree with this phrase or don't you? And people on one side are immediately accused of being in denial, and the others are accused of ignoring progress. So we have a kind of rather unproductive argument. So the issue for me is, how do we deal? How do we make change happen? There's an additional issue, by the way, which I think for those of us who, as it were, grown up in the race equality movement, we've got to deal with. And that is the fact that our experience has taught other groups of people something important. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is probably best put this way, that we understand racial prejudice. We really do, actually. We can see it, and we feel it, and we know it when we see it. Is it completely separate from misogyny? Is it completely separate from homophobia? Well, actually, if you look at the casework that we at the Equality and Human Rights Commission get, one of the things that you notice is that institutions and organisations where you find racial harassment, for example, you are almost always going to find sexual harassment of women. You are almost always going to find homophobia. The truth is that what we learned is that this tree of systemic racism bears other fruit. The roots that give rise to racist attitude also give rise to some poisonous branches which we call misogyny, homophobia, and by the way, religious bigotry as well. So I think that, again, one of the things that I think has changed over the last 10 years is that we have realised, and need to realise, that we're not alone in this, that there are other things going on. And if we're going to deal with the systemic expression of racism, which we call racism, if we're really going to deal with it, we have to deal with some other things. So I guess at root, what I'm not saying, and have never said, that institutional racism, as described in the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry Report, has been obliterated. What I do know, though, is that we need to not deal constantly with the same slightly off-the-edge argument, but deal with the real facts, evidence, and what is actually happening. And the reason that we can confront that is because change has happened, and that change has happened for some of the demographic reasons I've explained, but let me repeat, because of the work of people in this room. Dorian's the most celebrated example, but there are others here. We have changed things, and we need to recognise that as well. So, what do we do next? Well, as I say, we've got to complete some of the work of the past, but there are some new things. The biggest thing on our horizon is, of course, the Equality Bill. What will that bill do? Well, I think one important thing to recognise is that it will change and simplify and clarify the law. Currently, to get a comprehensive picture of anti-discrimination legislation, you have to get through 35 acts, 52 statutory instruments, 13 codes of practice, 16 European Union directives. That's about 4,000 pages of legislation. Well, it's pretty tough for anybody to comply with. It's pretty tough for anybody, us, to regulate it. But what is not tough to do is for people to get through the nooks and crannies in this rather complicated legislation. So quite often people say to us, why don't you enforce more? Why don't you use the legislation more? Well, the answer is, it's defective. And actually, it allows people to get away with far too much. So point one, more consistent, simpler, clearer legislation, I think, will make sure that people don't get away with things they shouldn't. But consolidation won't be enough. We think that the bill is going to need to be more ambitious, more courageous. Now, the government said that it's going to extend the public service or public sector duty across all 7 protected grounds. We want to resist any levelling down of provisions for race equality, and I think that we can say pretty safely that ministers are on the same page on that. And I also want to make a point very clearly, because it's been mentioned already this evening. We are very clear that an integrated duty does not mean any threat to funding, or should not mean any threat to funding, for single-focused organisations. Nothing in a new duty should work against funding for bodies, for example, like Rota. But we also need that duty to be simpler, stronger and more effective in the way it applies to everyone. We will be responsible for enforcing it, and again, let me be clear about that. We will enforce it. I know it's often said, why doesn't the Commission do more? Well, let me just, as a matter of fact, because I'm personally often surprised by what people believe. Many people talk about our use of enforcement powers as though we don't. Well, in 17 months of our existence, we have so far taken enforcement action in 90 cases. 90 cases. And when I say 90, I mean a local authority, a public hospital, in some cases a government department. Most of the time it doesn't trouble the courts and you never hear about it. And the reason is because most breaches are resolved pre-action. We write to them saying, fix it, and if you don't fix it, this is what's going to happen. And by and large, what then happens is they fix it. Now, we could make a great song and dance about that and be going around telling people how threatening and wonderful we are, but actually my own temperamental view about this is just get on with the business. If you sort it and get on with the next one. Perhaps we need to say more about this, but I want to be clear, we're not afraid to use powers and go to court. Last July, we intervened in a case against Ealing Council, Southall Black Sisters case. We were, with SBS, successful, and we made a difference to that organisation, and with them to the hundreds of women who would suffer brutality and violence if Southall Black Sisters were no more. And I think that was a victory for them and a victory for race equality, as well, of course, gender equality. You read about that in the papers. Perhaps we didn't read about the intervention we made in a case against the Ministry of Justice, challenging new rules that extend the use of restraint techniques within secure training centres. And that, of course, would have particular implications for young ethnic minority people who are overrepresented in those centres, as well as for human rights. Well, court agreed that there should have been an impact assessment in that case, and the new rules were quashed. We were involved in a case against London Borough of Harrow, wanted to restrict adult care services to people with critical needs only. Harrow confirmed that they would assess any proposed changes to the eligibility criteria for services in the future, essentially making sure that equality was preserved in that situation. My point is that we actually do use powers. But the point I want to make to you tonight, because I think it's important for the debate that you're going to have, is that I do think that there is still a problem. The law says, in relation to public service duty, that public authorities should have due regard to eliminating discrimination, promoting equality and good relations. It is not a duty necessarily to achieve any of these things. I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem. A law that says you must pay attention, but actually you don't necessarily have to change anything, is better than a law that doesn't say anything at all. But in the end, what we want is a law that says you have to change stuff. Compliance shouldn't be a matter of process, whether they complete the right paperwork in the right way. It should be a matter of whether they have changed the way they live. We shouldn't just be thinking about ticking the boxes, we should be thinking about changing people's experience. That doesn't mean that process doesn't matter. It does matter. For example, equality impact assessments I think are absolutely vital. They're an important hook for carrying out enforcement, but we need the law to do rather more than that. And that's why we want to see a reduction in red tape. If we simply extend the current public sector duty across the 7 strands, what in fact we'll be doing is saying there need to be, the way it works out, about 315,000 separate equality schemes across the board. Now this is ridiculous. We would have to have a commission the size of the Chinese Red Army to assess them and to make sure people comply. It just isn't going to happen. So we need a tool that is more than a bureaucratic paper chase, because what my real fear is that we're creating public services at the moment that are expert at following a process but don't change people's lives. What I don't want to do is to collude with creating an enforcement regime that talks big but is basically a paper tiger. So that's why we are proposing a duty which allows Secretaries of State to set targets for public authorities, and if they fail, we want a role for citizens, for activist groups to challenge authorities, to demand an explanation about why change hasn't been achieved. Not why you haven't filled in the scheme, but why you haven't moved the numbers. We want a duty that allows us to enforce against whether an authority has been able to reduce the gap, the equality gap between one group of people and another. Men, women, black, white, disabled, not disabled. We want equality impact assessments to be integral to all the policy work done by public authorities, and we want them done properly, with more analysis, more evidence, and less flannel. In a way, you could say that less flannel should be the motto for all the work that we do. We want more results, targeting, I think the point that you make in your banner, targeting our efforts properly on the places where discrimination is most pernicious and most dangerous. So, for example, with police, our big priority is obvious. It's stop and search. In prison, we're monitoring the treatment of ethnic minority prisoners at the moment in a number of prisons. Actually, to be more precise, we're forcing the prison service to monitor and reveal the results. We don't want inspectors. We want them to be doing it and publishing the results. We're conducting a formal inquiry now into race discrimination in the construction industry, which is one of the places you'd expect to see more ethnic minority people where it hasn't moved at all. And of course, one last point, and I think this responds to the correct point that Theo made, all this costs. And all of it has to be done on the ground in the real world. So last year, we've given £7 million to other organisations, including RACs, to do race equality work. And we're working towards a more sustainable approach to the grants programme. The point I really want to make, more than anything else, is this. Race matters to us. But it matters in a way that we need to learn, that says that we need to learn from the experiences and the successes as well as the failures of the past. And there have been successes. It's time for us to use that experience, to use what we've won to move people onto the next stage. Because actually, I think people are getting away with it. And I think we can do much better. And that's the point, really, of where we are. And that's why I think this bill is so important. There are other things, which I'm sure people will ask me about, but I just want to say tonight, for us, getting the right legislative framework is absolutely vital. That's it. Thank you.
Trevor, thank you very much. We take 10 minutes for questions. Okay. And I have a couple of volunteer dimblebees from
I have to buzz off in the next 6 minutes, basically.
Do I do my question now?
Okay, thank you. Where is it? Okay, sorry, bear with me. I'm going to do this very, very quickly. The Race Relations Amendment Act 2000 was enacted in the wake of the Stephen Rice inquiry to formally recognise and tackle the problems of institutional racism. 10 years on, the race equality duty has impacted on policies, processes and procedures, i.e. equality policies, employment monitoring, impact assessments and stock and account, etc. The evidence the MPA inquiry panel is hearing, of which I am chairing, received highlights that it's not the policies which are the problem, but the prevailing attitudes and informal practices which do most to create barriers and allow discrimination to continue. Can the forthcoming single equality duty address this effectively? If so, how?
Straight answer to that is, I wouldn't turn back the clock on the duty at all. I just wouldn't. Because if it did nothing else, it really was a wake-up call to everybody. It made people think harder. And it really put leadership. However, the point that you make, that I'm very interested to see that what what the last 8 or 9 years has shown, and I position to see this in almost anybody. I think I must have signed about 400 compliance notices when I was at CRE. The problem is that what happened over the 7 or 8 years is that people learned how to deal with the process. They know who to go to. They know which forms to fill in. What the process doesn't quite do is deal with, the things that that really hold people back. So, for example, one of the issues is promotion in organisations. Well, how do you get promotion? You get promotion partly because you have experience. They send you to conferences. They give you particular jobs to do. And we know one of the things that happens is, the director who will have his or her favourite person will make sure that they get that experience. Now, the problem is that the duty doesn't track that. It doesn't capture that. What we need to do is to find a way of dealing with those little things which happen on an everyday basis, and there are a million of them every year, that just tilt things away from ethnic minorities. Now, what is the answer to that? Well, my view is the answer is that you can't be poking around everywhere. What you can do, however, is say, what we're going to judge you on is not what, at the moment, you have to do, which is to show you've made an effort. What we're going to judge you on is, have you actually made a difference? Is the proportion of people at band 2 who are from ethnic minorities larger this year than it was last year? Don't care how you did it, but is it larger? And if it isn't larger, that's how you fail your compliance. At the moment, the law doesn't make you do that. It makes you, as long as you've shown, why you're trying to make a difference, it doesn't matter if it's successful or not. What we're trying to change things to is to say, we're not that interested in the process. What we're interested in is, has the number at band 2 changed? If it hasn't changed, we've got to explain why. If the explanation is good, then we are going to give you a program of action. And if you can't do the program of action, we think, actually, this is what we're proposing, Secretary of State ought to, as with schools, have the power to appoint somebody else who will.
My question is, what is the EHRC and CPS doing to encourage restorative justice and communication?
Well, I think the brief answer to that is that the CPS will have to answer for themselves. I know that the CPS is pro-restorative justice as one of the instruments. We have a handle in this insofar as we've got a role in mediation, or we have a mediation function. But if I'm honest, I would say that the principal way that we will help is by funding, supporting, for example, this project and other grassroots projects. I don't see the Commission sort of getting involved, because there are people who are much better at it, an expert at it, and our best role will be to make sure that they've got the resources to do it well.
In terms of schools reporting on racial incidents, this is not happening. What are the EHRC doing to ensure that racist incidents in schools are reported and recorded at both a local and a national level?
I think that, we know empirically, we know from anecdotally that that's true. I suspect that Ofsted hasn't got systematic evidence. And my view here is that the real place you need to go with this is that this should be a core function of Ofsted, because that's their job, to inspect schools. Now, we don't think that they are doing this or a number of other equality things very well, so we are at the moment in talks with Ofsted. We are either going to seek a memorandum of agreement with them about the way they do certain things, and or we are proposing that within the bill that inspection bodies, and that includes Healthcare Commission and so on as well, magistrates, HMIC, police inspectors, that they have certain, or their public sector duty is expressed in a particular way that would force them to use this kind of thing as a way of judging whether a school is successful or not. Because in the end, What's going to make people change? What will make them change is that their inspectorate says you're doing your job well or you're not doing your job well. If you're not doing your job well, you don't get as much money. So in the end, that's the way we think this needs to work.
I wonder if I could just clarify something you were saying when you were talking about racism. You used an interesting phrase, systematic expression of racism. Just trying to work out who or what you think where the systematic expression comes from, because all the indicators of racism you talk about are all in terms of outputs or outcomes. They're not about expressions or of intent that lead to those outcomes. So I'm just trying to clarify what you're saying when you talk about systematic expression of racism.
When I used the term expression, I didn't mean it in the sense of words. What I meant was it's real life expression. So, people are going to have all sorts of attitudes, and the system's going to have all sorts of abstract ways of doing things. When I talk about a systemic expression of racism, I mean, for example, the point that's just been raised about disproportionate or racially disproportionate exclusions. Now, I don't suppose anybody thinks that's happening because all teachers are racist, but something is happening which is to do with racial bias, and its expression is this disproportion. And it's technical language. But essentially, all I'm saying is that there is systemic bias of various kinds, and its expression is what happens to people. That's all I meant. I'll take one more now. I'm afraid I've got to run.
It's probably just a quick comment. You were talking about, when you're talking about enforcement, you mentioned the 90 cases whereby, I think just as a comment, because the talk is all about evidence, especially in the sector. So I think it would be good practice when you have actually used enforcement to try and publicize that, because at the end of the day, organizations or individuals within the community probably end up feeling that you're not actually enforcing because either they're not aware or probably those cases have not made it into the public media. So probably I would recommend that those things are either publicized, or if people ask for that information, then it is revealed. Because then people feel that the EHRC is actually doing something.
I think this is a completely fair point. I mean, we have settled 38. I think there are 35 still ongoing. There are 16 public bodies, including, I think, two government departments, who are subject to further compliance action, and a couple of what are technically known as assessments. And it is probably true that we don't sort of do enough to explain what's happening. I mean, there are sometimes practical reasons for this. For example, sometimes it will involve, it's trivial, or sometimes it will involve the way of settling it will involve some confidentiality, so we wouldn't be able to, we have to make a choice between whether we get the thing sorted or we make a song and dance about it but don't get it sorted. And frankly, our preference is always to get it sorted so that the thing that's going wrong gets fixed. But I agree with you, we could probably do a lot more to say out loud, this is what we're doing. You're always a bit conflicted about this because, and I'm speaking personally here, one of the things I most dislike about, for example, the way government does things is that they're always boasting about, we've done this and we've got this program here and we spent this money, and you hear about the same money that they spent 6 or 7 different times as though it's different money. And I think it's one of the things that leads people to mistrust public bodies, if they feel that your public bodies are always just basically bragging about themselves. But I think your point, which is just about fact and information, is a good one, and is one that we'll look at more. I'm sorry, would you forgive me? I I have to leave.
Trevor,
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity